The cameras were rolling when Derek Manning turned to his wife Sonia and snapped, loud enough for every microphone on stage to catch it clean. "Just answer the question right for once. You're embarrassing me." 200 people in that Family Feud audience went dead silent. Sonia's face flushed red, her hand still hovering over the buzzer she hadn't even had a chance to press yet. Steve Harvey's jaw tightened. He didn't laugh it off the way hosts sometimes do to keep the energy light. He set his cards down, looked directly at Derek, and said 4 words that stopped the taping cold. "Sir, step off stage." The morning had started like any other taping day at the Atlanta studio. Steve arrived just before 9, running through his usual warm-up bits with the crew, joking about the weather with a sound technician. Backstage, 2 families waited to compete. The Mannings from Birmingham, Alabama, and the Osai family from Maryland, a large, close-knit group of siblings and cousins who clearly enjoyed each other's company. Sonia Manning sat quietly beside her husband in the green room, adjusting her blouse collar over and over, a nervous habit that had nothing to do with the blouse and everything to do with years of learning to make herself smaller in rooms where Derek's mood might shift. Steve did his usual rounds, complimenting the family's outfits, cracking a joke about the Osai family's matching colors, unaware of the tension sitting quietly beside Derek Manning. But nobody in that studio knew what was coming. Sonia and Derek had been married 11 years. To the outside world, and even to most of their extended family, they looked like a stable, unremarkable couple. He worked in regional sales. She managed the front office at a pediatric dental practice. They had 2 kids in middle school and a modest house in a quiet subdivision. What almost nobody knew, because Sonia had spent years making sure nobody knew, was that Derek's temper had become a fixture in their household long before that day on stage, a pattern of criticism and correction so constant that Sonia had stopped noticing most of it herself. The way a person stops noticing a persistent hum after enough years of living beside it. It wasn't physical, not in the way that gets reported to authorities or shows up in a police record. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more corrosive precisely because it left no visible mark. Derek corrected the way she loaded the dishwasher. He corrected how she pronounced words at dinner parties, sometimes in front of guests, always with a small laugh that made it sound like affectionate teasing rather than what it actually was. He'd stopped introducing her by name at his company events years earlier, referring to her instead as my wife, in a tone that somehow managed to diminish the introduction rather than complete it. Sonia had brought it up exactly twice in 11 years. Both times met with Derek's insistence that she was too sensitive and reading into things, until she stopped bringing it up altogether and simply adjusted, the way water adjusts to the shape of whatever container holds it. The pattern had escalated slowly enough that Sonia could never point to a single moment where things changed, only a gradual accumulation she hadn't fully registered until she tried once to describe their marriage to a therapist she saw for exactly 3 sessions before Derek found the receipts and asked, pointedly, what exactly she needed to talk to a stranger about that she couldn't talk to him about. She canceled the 4th session and never rescheduled. She'd also stopped attending her college roommates' annual reunion trips after Derek commented, the 2nd year in a row, that her friends were a bad influence and made her act different. A claim Sonia privately suspected meant only that she seemed happier and more herself around them than she did at home, which Derek seemed to experience as some kind of threat rather than something to celebrate. Her co-workers at the dental practice noticed things in fragments nobody put together as a full picture. The way she flinched slightly whenever her phone buzzed during work hours, always checking it immediately, even mid-conversation with a patient's parent. The way she'd stopped talking about weekend plans with any real detail, offering only vague, deflecting answers when colleagues asked how her Saturday had gone. Her office manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd worked alongside her for 6 years, later admitted she'd wondered more than once if something wasn't right at home, but had never felt she had grounds to ask directly, not wanting to overstep into what felt like private territory. She told her sister on the phone that things were fine, just normal marriage stuff. She told her closest friend at work that Derek was just stressed with his job. She told herself, most nights, lying awake beside a man who'd spent the evening picking apart some minor thing she'd said or done, that this was simply what marriage looked like after over a decade, that the version of romance she'd expected at 24 had just naturally worn down into this quieter, harder thing by 35. She'd stopped wearing the earrings her mother gave her for her wedding because Derek once commented, in passing, that they looked cheap on her. A remark she'd absorbed so completely that she genuinely believed, years later, that she simply didn't like them anymore. The specific reason they applied for Family Feud wasn't glamorous. Derek had seen a segment about a family winning enough to cover a kitchen renovation he'd been wanting for over a year, and he filled out the application himself, listing Sonia as a co-contestant, almost as an afterthought. The way he seemed to treat most decisions that involved her opinion. Sonia went along with it, because saying no to Derek had, over 11 years, become a more exhausting proposition than simply going along, and because some small, still hopeful part of her thought that maybe a shared experience, something fun in public, might remind them both of who they used to be to each other. In the weeks leading up to the taping, Sonia found herself rehearsing potential answers in her head during quiet moments at work, not out of excitement for the game itself, but out of a familiar, low-grade anxiety about giving a wrong answer in front of Derek. A habit of anticipatory bracing she'd developed so thoroughly over the years that she rarely noticed she was doing it anymore. Her daughter, 12 years old and quietly perceptive in the way children raised in tense households often become, had asked her the night before the trip whether Dad was going to be in a good mood for the taping. A question that Sonia brushed off in the moment, but thought about for the entire 9-hour drive to Atlanta. The gang moved through its early rounds with typical energy. The Osei family was loud, quick on the buzzer, clearly enjoying themselves, and Steve fed off their energy the way he always does. The Mannings started strong too, Sonia answering 2 questions correctly in the first round, earning genuine applause from the crowd. But by the 3rd round, when Sonia gave an answer that didn't match the board, a perfectly reasonable, defensible guess that simply wasn't the survey's top response, Derek's face changed in a way the cameras caught before Steve did. He leaned toward her, and in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, said the words that would end the segment as everyone knew it. "Just answer the question right for once. You're embarrassing me." The studio fell completely silent. Steve's hand, which had been reaching for the next card, stopped mid-motion. His easy, performative host energy disappeared from his face entirely, replaced by something flatter and more serious. He looked at Derek for a long moment, then at Sonia, whose expression had gone carefully, practically blank in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd had to arrange her face like that in public. The audience, which had been laughing along with the show's rhythm moments earlier, sat in a hush so complete that a producer's clipboard shifting in the wings sounded unnaturally loud. Steve set his cards down slowly on the podium. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sir," he said, his tone even but unmistakably firm, "step off stage." Derek blinked, clearly assuming for a half-second that Steve was joking, the way hosts sometimes rib contestants for laughs. Steve's expression made clear immediately that he wasn't. "I'm not playing with you," Steve said. "Step off this stage right now." A producer near the wings signaled frantically for a break, and Steve waved him off without looking away from Derek. "No network approval needed for this," Steve said. "This is me, Steve Harvey, and what I just heard does not happen on my stage." Derek, flushing with embarrassment now himself, hesitated, glanced at the audience, and then walked off toward the wings, escorted by a stage manager who'd clearly never handled a moment quite like this one either. But Steve wasn't done. He walked over to Sonia, who stood alone now at the family podium, and knelt down slightly, bringing himself closer to her eye level even though she was standing. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest," he said gently. "How long has that been happening?" Sonia's composure cracked for the first time all day, her eyes filling as she admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper that the mic still caught clearly, "A long time. Longer than I probably want to admit." Steve nodded slowly, his own eyes wet now. "Let me tell you something," he said. "I grew up watching my mother hold a family together while carrying weight nobody should carry alone. And I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to stand up for somebody in that position, I wouldn't stay quiet just because it was uncomfortable television. Because 30 years ago, watching that, I learned that silence in a room like this just teaches everybody watching that this is normal. And it is not normal." He wasn't finished. Steve turned to face the cameras directly. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home right now," he said. "What you just saw happen on this stage happens in living rooms and kitchens every single day, quietly, without cameras, without an audience, without anybody stepping in to say something. If what you just watched looked familiar to you, I want you to know that you are not too sensitive, and you are not imagining it." Several women in the audience were visibly crying at this point, a few nodding as though recognizing something in their own lives they hadn't said out loud before. And then, he did something no one expected, even his own producers. He pulled out his phone right there on the stage and called a contact he'd worked with before at a national domestic support and counseling organization. "I need a full counseling and legal consultation package set up for a woman named Sonia Manning. Today. No waiting list," he said into the phone, loud enough for the front rows to hear every word. "And I want her connected with a support advocate this week, not next month." He hung up before waiting for a response, already certain of the answer. Steve turned back to Sonia. "You're going to finish this game today if you want to, and whatever you win is yours, not his," he said. "But more than that, I want you to know that somebody saw it on national television and said out loud that it wasn't okay." Sonia nodded, tears streaming freely now, and for the first time all day, her shoulders seemed to actually relax. And then, in a gesture nobody anticipated, the Osei family's eldest daughter crossed the stage, took Sonia's hand, and told her that their own mother had left a similar situation years earlier and had never regretted it for a single day. Steve announced that regardless of how the remainder of the game played out, both families would split the full fast money prize, ensuring Sonia walked away with resources of her own, independent of anything tied to Derek. 3 months after the taping, Sonia had moved into a small apartment of her own with her 2 children. The legal consultation Steve arranged having connected her with an attorney who helped her navigate a separation she said she'd needed the confidence to pursue for years. She described, in a follow-up conversation with Steve's team, finally understanding that Derek's corrections and put-downs, accumulated over 11 years, constituted a pattern of emotional abuse she'd never had language for until a stranger on a stage called it what it was. Her counselor, whom she began seeing weekly through the program Steve had arranged, helped her recognize the same pattern showing up in smaller ways, with her own children, and Sonia said learning to interrupt that cycle with her kids felt, in some ways, even more important than anything else that had changed in her own life. When the episode aired 5 weeks later, it crossed 230 million views across platforms within 10 days. and the hashtag #StepOffStage trended for an entire week, prompting a wave of women sharing their own similar experiences publicly for the first time. Many describing patterns of criticism and control they said they'd never had a clear name for until watching the clip. Several domestic advocacy organizations reported a measurable spike in hotline calls in the 2 weeks following the episode's release, crediting the segment with prompting people to recognize non-physical patterns of control they hadn't previously identified as something worth seeking help for. A year after the taping, Sonia had completed a certification program in office administration management, doubling her previous income, and had reconnected with several old friendships she said Derek had slowly discouraged over the years without her fully realizing it at the time, including the college roommate reunion trips she resumed attending for the first time in nearly 4 years. Today, the #StepOffStage Fund, named directly from Steve's own words that day, has provided emergency counseling and legal support to over 2,300 women navigating similar situations nationwide, and to date has distributed $16 million toward that mission, with a specific focus on the kind of quiet, non-physical patterns that rarely get recognized as urgent until somebody finally names them, including a free workshop series teaching advocates and counselors how to identify coercive control that leaves no visible evidence. Sonia still wears her mother's wedding earrings now, every single day, a small detail she mentioned in a later interview with something like quiet defiance. Her 12-year-old daughter, watching the recovery unfold over the following year, told a family friend that she'd noticed her mother laughing more, an observation Sonia said meant more to her than almost anything else that had changed. In a later conversation, Steve said that moment remains one of the only times in 45 years of hosting he made an on-the-spot decision he never once second-guessed. "I didn't need a script for that one," he said. "Some things you just know in your gut aren't right, and you deal with them right then, cameras or no cameras." He added that he'd received letters afterward from several men admitting they'd recognized their own behavior in Derek's outburst and had sought counseling of their own as a result. Something he called an unexpected but welcome ripple from a moment he never planned or scripted. Sonia still sends updates to Steve's team periodically, and recently thanked him for something she said she hadn't expected a game show host to ever give her: the simple public confirmation that she wasn't imagining any of it. What that moment revealed to 200 stunned people in a studio, and millions more afterward, wasn't really about one marriage or one man's temper. It was a reminder that dignity, once reclaimed even publicly and unexpectedly, has a way of rippling outward far beyond the moment it was reclaimed in, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stop shrinking in a room they'd long believed they had to shrink in. If this story about a wife finding her voice moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. Have you ever stood up for your own dignity when it would have been easier to stay quiet? Share your story in the comments below, and ring that notification bell for more moments that restore your faith in humanity.